This is part two of chapter one from the Archer and Hughes textbook, so you may want to listen to part one before you continue on with part two. So we're going to talk about a couple of the principles that align with explicit instruction in a little more detail. So this is something we want to think about from now until the end of time. I think I'm funny, by the way. Optimize academic learning time, okay, or ALT. So if you look at this graphic, this is a time and the school day, or time and the school day. And we want to think about that. It's not just time, right? Maybe we have 8 hours or 7.5 hours a day, but what happens during that time? Okay, so here's our available time. They said 6 hours. I always thought school days were a little longer, but potato, potato. So here's our available time, right? Here's our allocated time, where we're not thinking about, or we're taking out lunch, recess, special areas, stuff like that. So going back to available time for 1 second. So this is the amount of time available for all school activities in a day. Okay, then, sorry, I forgot to say this. Then with the allocated time, we want to think about the amount of time dedicated for instruction in academic content. We want to think about increasing this because research has shown that increasing allocated time, and hold on, we'll get to the other ones, has shown a slight positive impact on student achievement. So again, that's, where, okay, it goes from 6 hours to 4 hours. We're already down 2 hours because of things like recess and special areas and lunch and all those things that have to happen, but that's decreasing our academic learning time. Okay, so then we move here to engage time. So this is the amount of time students are actively engaged. Actively, remember that is a key word because as we talked about on like slide one, learning is not a spectator sport. So we want to think about the amount of time students are actively engaged in a learning task. There is a positive correlation between engaged time and achievement, which makes sense, right? The more actively engaged they are, they will have, more success. And then here, this is the part that's a little concerning. Out of the 6 hours available in a day, the academic learning time on average is 1 hour. 1 hour, people. That's a lot of content to pack into 1 hour, right? So this is the amount of time students are successfully engaged in academic tasks at the appropriate level of difficulty. So meaning not too hard, not too easy, but kind of like Goldilocks, right? Just right. There's a strong link, as you would assume, between the academic learning time and achievement. So what we want to think about, how can we increase this academic learning time? What can we do to increase this 1 hour to get it closer up here? Okay, because 1 hour, whew, I struggle with, I teach 3 hour classes. I struggle to get the content in that time. So whew, an hour that just astounds me. I'm going to move along. Otherwise, we'll be there all day. So principle number two, promote high levels of success. Again, student engagement, active learning, right? We've been talking about this, plus successful performance, or student engagement, I kind of should say, and active plus active learning maybe leads to successful performance. You want to make sure, again, that you are prepared, that you have rules, you have procedures, you don't waste any of that time because as we learned, there's not a whole lot of time available, right? So you want to be really efficient. And we'll talk about some of these things as we go on through the semester. Focus on that critical content. Again, teach the stuff, cut the fluff. We want to find instruction and instructional levels that are just right. And we want to try to decrease those transition times. Yes, it's, sometimes we need a few minutes, especially if you have younger students, especially if you have students with some significant disabilities. You need that transition time. But you also want to think about, okay, how can I anticipate what the struggle might be with this transition that's going to take 10 minutes, where if I could remove that struggle, the transition could take 2 minutes. That's 8 minutes you just gained back, right? So you also want to think about, the student engagement. You don't want students to practice errors though, right? So you don't want to give them like a page of, 50 problems, which don't do that anyway. And then say, okay, here's a worksheet. Just let me know when you're done. No, 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 because what if they mess up on the first one or the second one and they keep doing that same error? That's going to be some wasted academic time because then you're going to have to go back and reteach. And they're going to have to, excuse me, this is more important, they're going to have to relearn what they just practiced incorrectly for 50 problems. So you want to make sure you're monitoring their progress often. One way to do that is, okay, we have 10 problems we're going to do for your independent practice or for your review. I want you to do one problem and put your pencil down. I will come to you to check your first problem before you can go on to the rest of the problems, right? To make sure that they are on the right track. Okay, again, you also want to teach routines. We've talked about this a little bit, routines, procedures, even for things like handing in homework, assignments. How are they going to get assignments back? What are transition? How are they going to transition if you're using learning centers? How are they going to transition? What are their expectations, or what are your expectations and theirs for coming into the classroom and being prepared to start the day? And we'll talk more about that again as we move along this semester. So principle 4, I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to kind of hit on a couple of them. Grouping for instruction. So you want to think about how or if it's appropriate to group. So that could mean partner learning. That could mean small groups. That could mean, you have a small group at a table while there are 3 other groups where one's working on a task on the computer, one's working collaboratively on another task back in the reading area, and one is doing some kind of an academic game or reinforcement or enrichment. And how are you going to rotate those groups? So in order for grouping to be effective, instruction needs to be effective. So we need to make sure that our instruction, that your instruction really, that you are providing is effective. And then the group instruction can be efficient and effective. And there are a number of benefits to grouping for instruction. You can have closer monitoring of those students. If you have, a small group of 4 or 5 students right in front of you, you can monitor those students a lot easier than if you're in a classroom of 30 trying to monitor everybody all at once. Some students with special needs, groups of 6 to 8, that's a little large, I think, maybe 4 or 5. Think about it. If you have an individual who struggles with reading and you say, okay, everybody, we're going to read out loud in front of the class, they might not want to do that. They might do some behaviors so they get removed from class so they don't have to read out loud. But if you're in a group of 2, 3, 4, that student might be more apt to read out loud with just a smaller group. It also forces students to be more academically engaged. If they have to, especially if they're just with a peer and they have to kind of take turns, they have to listen to others, they have to make contributions, they're going to be more actively engaged. And there's also more opportunity for peer interactions in some of these groups. Okay, grouping instruction by instructional needs, current functioning level, they might change over time, and that's okay. Whole group or small group, there's stuff to be said for whole group instruction as well. You just don't want to do it all the time, in my opinion. All right, principle 5, scaffolding instruction. So this is support to help students learn, support that you provide or maybe that other students provide, and gradually removing this support over time as students show success. It's also been called the gradual release of support. So when a student is first learning, or when students, plural, are first learning new skills or complex skills, you as the teacher really want to provide a lot of support. So I talked about this in part 1. The first part would be, watch me, I'm going to model. Here's a new skill, I'm going to model for you. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples that I do, me as the teacher, your turn to watch. Okay, now let's talk about some together. I want you to get with your shoulder partner. Let's work on these next 3 problems. I'm going to ask you some questions. We're going to work together. Okay, now I'm going to release that support and I want you to show me what you know independently. So, we will talk about this as the semester goes along. And we want to think about, this really helps to address working memory deficits, poorly organized knowledge, all of those things. But again, you're providing a lot of support at the beginning or in the new skills, complex skills, and then you're fading yourself back and allowing the students to really take control. So some ways to scaffold instruction: breaking down complex skills into manageable chunks. So instead of giving them an entire essay and say, okay, here you go, write a 6-paragraph essay. No, you would take some time, practice identifying the parts of an essay in samples or good models. You would use graphic organizers for visualization of how all the pieces fit together. You would work part by part gradually over time, over 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. And then students would receive explicit feedback on each section. You also want to make sure your sequencing skills logically, we've talked about this, provide clear explanations and models. Again, try not to be, don't be a me, try not to be too wordy and don't use complex language terminology to teach a new skill. Once they get to the point where they understand the skill, then you can start using a little more, the more challenging language and terminology. But make sure when you're starting off that you're providing them the clearest definition, the clearest example. You want to model the exact behavior that you want the students to produce. So whether it's saying a word correctly by blending several sounds together or writing a hypothesis when working on a science experiment. So you can use scaffolding and explanations and models in any content area, not just math as people think. Okay, so you can provide hints or prompts, is more that scaffolding. Graphic organizers, there are tons of graphic organizers out there, and there's some really, really great ones that help your students learn a new skill. There's also cue cards, checklists, stuff like that to remember the steps of a skill or strategy. There's visuals, steps to solving a math equation. You can fade that over time. There might be a checklist for editing a paragraph, verbal prompts, stuff like that. Okay, so there's numerous ways to scaffold instruction. So a few key points of explicit instruction. It's not the only way to teach. So it's important to include many of these elements throughout your day or throughout your teaching, but there are other ways, of course, to teach. This is just the one that, we're going to talk about. You want to base your instructional decision on student needs, current levels of performance. That goes back to that monitoring of their progress. We're not going to wait until the end of the quarter or the end of the semester or the end, as I said before, of the year to monitor their progress. We want to make sure we're monitoring progress as we go. Okay, and then effective when teaching new content, explicit instruction is effective when teaching new content, especially to struggling learners or to those learners, who have been identified with a learning disability or ADHD or autism, stuff like that. So you want to think about when to use explicit instruction and when you might not use explicit instruction. So some of those just for you, examples and non-examples. All right, so just to kind of summarize again, some key points of explicit instruction. The more you teach plus how well you teach it equals the more students will learn. So if this arrow goes way up to over here, right? You teach this much content, but you teach it really, really, really poorly, the students are going to struggle to learn. So you can control how well you teach the content. So you want to make sure you have a nice balance between the quantity that you're teaching and the quality, and that will impact the students' overall learning. So explicit instruction has been supported over many, many years by research and also through the U.S. Department of Education for both gen ed and special ed students. People always think, oh, explicit instruction, that's just for special ed students. No, it's not. It's just good instruction. To me, good instruction is good instruction, okay? Active learning, modeling, examples, non-examples, all of these things could, leads to engaged time, more content coverage, appropriate, right? Levels of success, all more scaffolding. All of these things will impact how much, I guess, the students will learn. Okay, so just keep this in mind. It is research-based. It really works well, especially for, again, all students, but especially for some of those struggling students. All right, so this is just an exit question just for you. You do not have to submit it. You do not have to turn anything in, but just for you to think about this. Identify 3 of the 16 elements of explicit instruction as defined by Archer and Hughes. So remember, we had the 16 elements and then we had the 6 principles. This question is talking about the elements specifically. So again, just think about this. You don't have to submit anything. See if you can name 3 of the elements and maybe in your notes or head, just for your own knowledge, not for me, think about if you can elaborate on any of those elements, any of those 3 elements a little bit more. Okay, that is it for chapter 1. I will see you back for chapter 2.